Jacob and Esau, the original sibling rivalry. It's a strange story, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of background about it, because even after doing that, it still doesn't make a lot of sense. I want to focus on the transaction that occurs in this text. And I ask the question, how much is your birthright worth? For the sake of our recorded audience, I'm going to share just a few of the verses that are the foundation for the sermon from Genesis 25, verses 29 to 34. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We all know the names and the sequence of the patriarchs. These are the patriarchs of the Hebrew Bible for those of you who went to children's church or Sunday school back in the day. For the rest of y'all, please meet Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They are the patriarchs of the Hebrew Bible. But if the birthright practice of the ancient Near East, which was that the eldest son would receive the bulk of the inheritance, and I say bulk, I mean the eldest son would get half, and the other sons would get a share of what's left over. And so to be the firstborn son, yes, it was a very patriarchal society as well, to be the firstborn son had its privileges if your parents had anything. And so Abraham and Isaac had prospered, and so Jacob was eyeing that birthright, that inheritance. And as we all know, if you want to see a family fight, go to probate court. Amen? And so this scenario, again, it's a very odd scenario, and I don't want to get too far into it. But just to say, if the practice that was common in the ancient Near East had been followed, we would know the patriarchs as Abraham, Isaac, and Esau. But we don't. And this story is told, or maybe even invented, but there are two interpretations. We're talking about individuals in a family, or each of these names represents a community, a family tree, a lineage, not just individuals. And these 12 tribes that would come out of Jacob represent the families of this kingdom that would become the kingdom of Israel. And so, the story was simply told to explain to people that cared about this Hebrew epic why Jacob was the patriarch and not Esau. I think they could have done it in a lot simpler way and just told us about the birth of Jacob and be done with it. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But anyway, Jacob would later be known as Israel. So I'm sorry, but Esau gets a bad rap. Every commentary on the passage blames Esau for not valuing his birthright. I mean, you think that they would have some critique for Jacob, who wouldn't even give his brother, starving and dying, a bowl of soup. But no. Jacob is considered clever. Jacob is considered, yes, he gets a bad name, but he comes out on top. He forces Esau to sell his birthright. And, you know, the father's not about to die, it's not imminent, and so Esau says, look, what good is my birthright if I'm starving to death or if I die? But all these commentaries still twist themselves into knots, trying to explain why God has created the biggest sibling rivalry since, you know, the beginning of time, Cain and Abel. Well, first of all, this story is interesting because we have twins. I'm not sure that was necessary. He could have just had Jacob born first. Anyway, secondly, we have Daddy's favorite. Now, Daddy liked Esau because Esau was skilled with the arrow, went out and hunted, brought him that meat that he liked, and Jacob was more of a mama's boy. He liked to follow her around in the kitchen all up under her apron strings, and he learned to cook. Now, if anybody told you that parents don't have favorite children, they're lying. You know it. Don't say it out loud. But I can't imagine that the parents of someone that they could come and hear play piano every Sunday doesn't have a favorite. When I was in Los Angeles and I was preaching every Sunday at the Congregational Church of Christian Fellowship, my parents came to church. Now, they belonged to the United Methodist Church, but they came every Sunday, and I said, Mom, Dad, you don't have to come every Sunday, you know? But they said, we don't know when the last one will be. So while we're able, we come and we see and cherish our children every opportunity we get. So yes, we do have favorites. I'm not going to tell you who mine is because they might be listening. I love all y'all, but I love the one who's actually zooming into worship the most. So anyway, if we take Esau at his word, he was starving. You know, maybe he'd been on the hunt for a couple, 2-3 days, and maybe he hadn't been able to shoot the game. Maybe his arrow was off and he missed. He might have been starving. Let's take him at his word. Indeed, if Esau died of hunger, Jacob would inherit the birthright anyway. So I don't see Esau as really being that careless. I just think his brother Jacob was conniving. But all the commentaries like to issue their judgment of Esau, that he simply didn't value his birthright highly enough. Well, we don't use that term very often until recently. So what is birthright? Well, Webster says birthright is a noun meaning a particular right of possession or privilege one has from birth, especially as an eldest child. The second or the next definition is birthright is a natural or moral right possessed by everyone. For example, education is a birthright of every child. That's what Webster said. I didn't say that. That's what Webster said. And then they add, just for the heck of it, birthright also earns 19 points in Scrabble. For all you Scrabble players. And that is one of my favorite childhood memories. My parents played Scrabble with me all of my childhood life and helped me to pass the SAT vocabulary section. So the United States, however, is starting to use this word birthright. and we might not have been familiar with it, but we are now facing a very profound question about birthright in the United States. Last week, the Supreme Court of the United States issued this holding. Children born in the United States to parents unlawfully or temporarily present are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and are citizens at birth under the 14th Amendment and its Citizenship Clause. It was, as reported, a 6-3 decision issued June 30th of 2026. This decision struck down the executive order with Chief Justice and Justices Kavanaugh, Brown Jackson, Sotomayor, who am I missing? Kagan and Roberts and Barrett joining. However, the court split 5-4 on the constitutional question. The 6-3 ruling said that this birthright cannot be negated by a presidential executive order. That is not an instrument that can be used to change the Constitution or its meaning. But one of the justices said, but Congress, if they want to pass a statute, they could change it. But the 5-4 decision was on the constitutional question. Chief Justice Roberts, I'm not getting my slides to move. Chief Justice Roberts delivered the opinion of the court. At issue in this case is whether the Constitution guarantees citizenship to children born of parents unlawfully or temporarily present in the United States. The 14th Amendment provides all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, I didn't go to law school, but it sounds pretty straightforward to me. Justice Roberts, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, in their rulings, quoted Frederick Douglass. Now, I didn't go to law school, but these Supreme Court rulings usually cite court precedent or major decisions or other acts of government. They cited Frederick Douglass in their ruling on birthright citizenship. Now, you may have an inclination as to why. Well, Frederick Douglass was one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, abolitionists in the United States at the time that the 14th Amendment was passed and adopted. And so he had some insight that it was passed so that African Americans, people of African descent, who under the Dred Scott decision had been denied, quote unquote, any rights that white people must recognize. That's what the ruling said, that black folks had no rights in America and were not citizens and had no rights that needed to be respected. So this 14th Amendment was a overruling, overturning of the Dred Scott decision, and yes, Frederick Douglass was a certain authority on that. So anyway, I wasn't surprised that Justice Brown Jackson quoted Frederick Douglass, but I was a little surprised that Justice Roberts quoted Frederick Douglass, and I was a bit chagrined that Justice Thomas quoted Frederick Douglass, but we won't go there. But Justice Roberts recognized that this was part of the abolitionist movement. And abolitionists swore to undo what the court had done in the Dred Scott decision. And Frederick Douglass at the time said, by birth, Frederick Douglass insisted, we are American citizens. The Constitution knows all the, I love this word, all the human inhabitants. That's everybody. The Constitution knows all the human inhabitants of this country as the people. He explained, no matter their color, class, or clime. He says, all I ask of the American people is that they live up to the Constitution, adopt its principles, imbibe its spirit, and enforce its provisions. When this is done, Douglas predicted, the glorious birthright of our common humanity will once again become the inheritance of all the inhabitants of this highly favored country. He wasn't asking anything extraordinary. He wasn't asking anything special. He said, just live up to the Constitution and all will be well. And so this is the question of the moment. What is the birthright of the children born on U.S. soil? Now, Jacob exploited his brother, who was in a moment of weakness and need. And he essentially, and the rest of the Bible recognizes this, he stole his birthright. But he stole it fair and square. So it became his. He stole his birthright. I submit to you that today there are those who want to exploit children and to steal their birthright just like Jacob did. Birthright citizenship built this country. You know, one of the charges against King George in the Declaration of Independence that we just celebrated last week, one of the charges against King George was that he prevented the population of the colonies. And one of the main ways that they populated the colonies was that every child that was born here was automatically a citizen of the United States or a citizen of the colony in which they were born. And when the colonies became the United States of America, that same policy and practice carried over. And they said, everyone born here is an American citizen. That's the way it was. There weren't a lot of laws or regulations. It was the common law of England, and they adopted that and took out the part where you owed allegiance to the king and put in that you owe allegiance to the Constitution. But your relationship was based on the fact that you were born within the jurisdiction of the United States. So we recognize birthright citizenship when it serves us, but we start to reject birthright citizenship when it brings a few unexpected guests, when it brings more diversity than we intended. Now, this change in attitude is clearly, and I'm not saying this, I mean, read the transcript. Read the transcript of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Read the transcript of the immigration policies that were enacted at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. This change in attitude is rooted in sheer racism. It's right in the text. No Chinese. Even though the Constitution said anybody born here is an American. Now, fortunately, we have begun, and at different times, we have overturned Dred Scott, and we have overturned the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we have made some progress. And so the Dred Scott decision denied birthright citizenship to people of African descent. It's the same impulse that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's the same impulse that led us to restrict immigration by nationality. Immigrants who are undocumented are so because we created laws that required documents when they didn't have them. We could solve the problem not by deporting or mass deportation. We could solve the problem by legislation. We really could. We don't want to solve the problem collectively. Oh, yes, yes, yes. We say, get in line. And they say, there is no line. And now we are sending ICE agents out to capture, incarcerate, and deport people. This is not much different from the slave catchers before the Civil War, who would roam the city streets, even in the northern climes of Boston. I remember when I was living in Boston, that was one of the heritages, one of the history part of that city, that they had posters that say, beware of the slave catchers. I said, I thought Massachusetts had banned slavery. They had banned slavery, but they had not banned slave catchers. And so in cities across this country that have declared themselves sanctuary cities, they haven't been able to exclude ICE agents who roam the city streets looking for runaway slaves. That was the slave catchers, now looking for undocumented folk. But even back then, if they could not accurately identify the runaway slave, they didn't hesitate to arrest them. They just said, we'll sort that out when we get down to Alabama. And of course, there are stories where people who were not formally enslaved or who had bought their freedom were re-enslaved by these slave catchers. And they were aggressive. And often they would take a person legally free and sell them into slavery. But the slave catchers didn't care. They didn't care because they got a bonus. They got a bounty for every black person they returned to slavery. ICE agents are careless and could care less if the person they arrest is the right person. In Houston, Texas last week, a man was killed by ICE agents, Lorenzo Salgado Arujo. It was later reported that he was not even the person they were looking to arrest. But they saw someone that fit the description. They pursued him and shot him and killed him anyway. Witnesses to the shooting now face deportation before any investigation is concluded. Just like the slave catchers. No justice, no punishment, no accountability. It took a civil war to end the practice of slavery. What will it take to end this moral outrage of murder and mayhem conducted by the Department of Homeland Security in our name? We should heed the rest of this story. You see, Esau did ultimately thrive, and Jacob had a life of trouble and challenges. He was never quite comfortable in his own skin because he knew what he had done. And his whole life was a whole series of problems. He was a cheater, he got cheated. He was a liar, he got deceived. And the one who wrestled in the womb with his brother would ultimately find himself wrestling in the dark with God. Go to Sunday school, find out about that. He was one who wrestled with God all night long because he needed a blessing, because his own guilty conscience would not let him let God go until God blessed him. That is what we need right now. We need to wrestle with God. We need to wrestle with our conscience. We need to wrestle with the reality of our origins. Just like Jacob, we stole the blessing that was intended for someone else to build this country. Just like Jacob, we will not live in peace until we make restitution, and we will not live without looking over our shoulder until we pay reparations. And when we do, then and only then will the blessings we desire truly rest upon us. So let us learn the lesson that the story is teaching. Esau did not value his birthright highly enough, they say. Yes, well, I say there are two sides to this story. The migrants, the refugees that come to the United States, like the story says, forsaking their homeland, their birthright in Guatemala, their birthright in Sudan, their birthright in Somalia, their birthright in Mexico, forsaking it because they are starving, forsaking it because they are in danger, forsaking it. What good will their birthright do if they are dead? But we should learn the lesson that the commentaries want to teach. You see, because we are being deceived. We are not on the edge of death. We are not in danger of losing our nation. With each new immigrant, with each new immigrant we receive, we are becoming more of who we are, of who we have always been, a strong, diverse, creative, innovative, optimistic America. We should value our birthright, our priceless birthright, to a nation that is proud of its compassion, secure in its prosperity, and hopeful for its future. So let us not trade this noble birthright for a pot of the lentil soup of false security. Let the people of God say, amen.